let's go back, yet again, to the 1950s with this. This is the very first cutaway flat top model ever commercially produced. That's right, this is the Gibson CF100. It was in their lineup between 1950 and 1959, and they're a little on the rare side. This one was built in 1954. What it is, basically, is an LG2 model, fairly small flat top, with a great big scoop removed from the treble side up about there. And for a first attempt, boy, they really went for it, didn't they? That's extremely pointy. This is the Florentine style cutaway as opposed to the Venetian one. The Venetian is, the side is bent around the curve in a continuous piece. The Florentine has the pointy thing. As almost always, there's a repair story. This was converted at some point to an electric. Well, Gibson itself produced the CF100E starting in 1951, the next year. They put a pickup at the end of the neck. Basically, it's the guts of a P90, just like they did later with the J160, the dreadnought size flat top the Beatles used in the early days. You can tell that this is not an original C100E because there's a lot more space between the end of the fingerboard and the front of the sound hole, and there would be a line of little holes for the pole pieces of the pickup. But like I say, this has been unconverted. The holes where the volume and tone controls were have been plugged, and the soundboard has been refinished. I believe the entire guitar has at least got overspray on the back and sides. There's also some side cracks which have been refinished over, and the finishing job is nice. I think they added a little hint of cherry red into the burst here, so it might be a little bit more red than original examples, but I think it's really pretty nonetheless. It's a good looking guitar. Players of note, well, the only one that really springs to my mind immediately would be Leon Redbone. We lost Leon a few years ago. He played old-time rag and Tin Pan Alley stuff, things from the Great American Songbook. If you don't know him, you should check him out, because he was kind of like a living character study, a theatrical construct. Like, he was a very mysterious, strange kind of guy who sang songs out of the teens and 20s, and very distinctive. Great player. Anyway, there is no saddle left on this guitar. It is all gone. They squeezed every last drop of life out of it, believe me. And it's time for the neck reset. The nice thing is nobody decided to shave height off the top of the bridge. These are already fairly low bridges. This seems to be original height. They did, however, cut extremely deep string ramps to get some downward pressure. But even then, it's kind of plinky. It sounds a little like, I don't know, like it's made of aluminum or something. The action, of course, is perfect. It's better than it came from the factory. It's 5/64 on the bass side, 4.5 on the treble. Ideal, really. And the relief is good too. There's only 0.08 of relief in the neck. So this is wholly about the kind of auditory response and not about playability issues, because it plays just fine. So this is a neck reset that's devoted to, trying to make it sound its best. Of course, there is the possibility of some complications, especially in a guitar that has been refinished or oversprayed. Like, there is, a lot of lacquer on these things to begin with in the area between the heel and the sides, so we'll have to cut through that because there's been a bunch more added. And this area here, the lacquer, actually the brown, comes up onto the side of the binding, and that is kind of a nasty sort of trick to pull on us, because we have to cut through it and hope that it doesn't crack away. The other thing is, these guitars, of course, have a very flush heel along the side of the cutaway here. It's, perfect in this instance. There's not even a crack in the lacquer. Of course, this whole area has been resprayed, and there is one long sort of goobery thing there. As I've mentioned in recent videos, anytime we've got this curved profile to the heel and we have to remove a bunch of material from the end, this flush fit tends to go away because we start to reduce this both in width as well as length. So there tends to end up being a lip there, which is just something we'll have to live with. The back is in excellent shape. Really nice. There are a couple of cracks. I think they might be cold checks in the lacquer, but we'll also have to inspect that really closely to make sure that they're not open. The period appropriate double line Clouson Deluxe tuners. Double line because we've got two lines of text on them. One says Clouson, the other says Deluxe. Later on it would just be Clouson Deluxe in a single line. And then there are no lines, which actually do have a line, but it's not got any text in it. The neck is in excellent condition too. One little sort of delamination spot there behind the second or third fret. A couple little dings in the places where these things usually end up after they get rested against something sharp. With a straight edge projecting the top of the frets to the front of the bridge, it meets about halfway down. There's about 5/30 seconds worth of space between the underside of the straight edge and the top in that area, with the string tension on. With no string tension, there's very little difference, almost none, which would suggest that we've got a good stiff top on this guitar. It doesn't move very much. It doesn't pull up or get pushed around too much by the string tension, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. Some slight deforming of the soundboard under tension is kind of normal, and if you have absolutely none, sometimes that means it's overbuilt. Just looking through the sound hole, I see there are a couple of side cracks which have been cleated, and there's a bunch of what looks like white sawdust up around the center strip there where it meets the third back brace. Like it was never vacuumed out after someone did some kind of sanding in there. So, better look inside. Things seem kind of typical. It looks as though the bridge has been re-glued at some point, as there's some seepage through the pinholes. And it also seems when that was done, the two retaining machine screws, usually on either side, were not included, which is a choice. Interesting. The glue squeeze out seems to vary from place to place. Like on the finger braces there, it looks almost like white aliphatic glue rather than hide glue, which is perplexing. Looking down towards the end of the body, what's this little thing here? Why, it's an errant cleat, earmarked, no doubt, for some other location in the guitar, which got out of control and fell into the murky depths. And the repair person thought it would be shielded from the eyes of the world, his secret safe. But, like the antagonist in a play by Euripides, all has come to light. We know your secret shame, sir. Someone has swapped out the original plastic bridge pins for ebony ones with no slot. These are non-slotted, which kind of makes sense given how deeply cut the string ramps are. The lacquer on the sides of the heel has to be sliced through because it's so thick. Some heat will be helpful. I'm using a candle here, vanilla scented because I'm fancy. It's not the best thing, to be honest. An alcohol lamp might be cleaner and impart less soot on the blade, but it works. Can only do about 3 centimeters at a time. It's really thick lacquer because there's the original stuff on there and then whatever was put on in the respray. Heat and free up the fingerboard extension. Then score along and remove the 15th fret for access. Drill some holes for my heat probes. I hit the pocket right on. In go the electrodes. Say it with me again, folks. These are from Hot Wire Foam Factory. I'll turn them on and let them go for about 10 minutes. Because this is a hide glue joint and because this is a Gibson guitar with a lot of area to the front of the heel which sometimes gets glue, I'll occasionally put a little droplet of water in there halfway along to get a little steam into the process as well. Just a little bit. Just a little squirt. Now this is something new. Seems like the wood has swollen really tightly around the shafts here. I've used these things on 20 guitars now. It's the first time this has ever happened, but I can't easily pull this out. Now this one is stuck too. It must be full of glue or something. After 3 rounds of heat, it really hadn't budged at all, and I decided to resort to steam. About 1 in 20 Gibsons seem to need it. They won't do it any other way. It took a lot of steam before a wiggle appeared, and even then, it just did not want to come free. So I wiggled and wiggled, and at which point I realized, yep, this is one of those fabled guitars assembled with the soundboard over top of the dovetail pocket. The board was bulging, but there's no way the neck will come out without massive damage, unless I can cut through the spruce that's in the way. I use a portion of a thin-bladed Japanese saw to slice through the center of the 15th fret in between my steam holes there, down through the fingerboard and into the pocket. I need to finesse it with some jabby cuts with a long knife as well. And finally, even then it still took some doing, it came free, and there you can see the soundboard on top of the dovetail. Okay, time to unclench and regroup. I had to go back and watch some of the video because I know I missed some of it. My battery went in the middle of everything. The bizarre thing is, I mentioned this as a remote possibility to the owner when he dropped the guitar off. Not sure why. I've encountered 2 neck over dovetails in 13 years. How did I have this premonition? I don't know. I'd never heard about this being an issue with this particular model, and I don't even know that it is. I heard Mark Stuttman describe recently the number of factory retops that Gibson was doing back in the 1930s, and just how common it was. A lot of those LOOs and smaller guitars, etc., had tops, although they were made of, Adirondack spruce, they caved right in, seemingly almost immediately. Someone gets their guitar, puts 13s on it, and then tunes it up to open E. That exceptionally lightly built LOO has suddenly 180 pounds of string tension on it, and they just go crunch. And I think Mark said something like 10% or even more were coming back for warranty repair. A huge number that had to get fixed. And it seems like top over was one way of doing that. The last time I encountered this was a 1936 or 37 Gibson catalog guitar. Basically a Gibson with a different label on it, like a Kalamazoo. It was a Carson J. Robeson, some Montgomery Ward catalog guitar. Basically an LOO with a different label. People ask why a company like Gibson would build like this, and I can't answer that. Because I'm not even sure this was ever really doctrine. This probably wasn't the standard procedure ever. But the repair department sees catastrophic soundboard damage, and they just route off the old top with the neck in place, saw or chisel the remaining spruce off from under it, the fingerboard extension, then they could slip a new top in there. Perhaps even thin down a bit at the upper end, which is something John Graven once observed. I'm not sure if he ever attributed it to repair technique or if he thought it was standard procedure, but they do seem to get thinner up here sometimes. Then they could add a wedge of spruce to take up that little bit of space, send it back to the finishing department. It was quicker than trying to repair a broken top. You can take a fully assembled top off the line and put it right in there. But it also seems like they may have done batches of guitars this way in initial assembly. Maybe. I'm not sure what it would do to the speed of production, because remember, these guitars were all finished after the neck was attached, so it probably didn't make much of a difference to things. But setting the neck angle might have required some care. I don't know. Maybe it was an experiment tried several times over 20 years with small batches of various models, just never caught on. I'm not sure there's anyone living who could really tell you why. As a repair person, you can imagine how frustrating it is, because there's no real way to know what's going to happen until you're in there. And when you see that soundboard lifting, it's almost too late, because you're on the edge of breaking something. The thing is, if you're resetting Gibsons often, you know how variable the dovetail fitting can be, and even the standard neck, there can be real problems pulling them out, because they'll fight you all the way due to lots of different size shims or just general weirdness. And it's going to take a while for you to figure out what's going on. In this case, with the steam, I've got a little bit of blushing in several areas, and all the lacquer on the base of the heel, in this case, just slid right off. So rather than a straightforward reset, I'm now going to be doing careful and extensive finish work on this. It's not a little touch-up along the sides of the heel, which is necessary, usually. This is now a multi-week job because there's a lot of lacquer, a lot of thickness that has to cure, and I have to wait, to be honest, for all of these parts to get good and dry before I can try and fit them together again. They've got to sit for several days. So it's not going to be in this video, obviously. You'll see it eventually. So let's see if we can work on some other finishing. Other things about this particular example, there was a lot of glue on the front surface of the side here and the heel, which is really kind of a nightmare because it's so far away from the heat source, and also sometimes the steam has a difficult time penetrating. And I know I haven't said it very much lately, but penetration is still very much paramount. So it's sticky, and so much so that there's a portion of the side here which is still adhered to the front of the heel. My heat probes were in right position. I hit the pocket right on. Don't know why it was so difficult to pull them off. And also more evidence that this may in fact be a retop, because this binding comes along and this section here appears to be different. It seems to have been cut right along the edge of the heel. So if a new top was put on, they could bind up to the heel and not have to go past into the section that's under the wood. So that's fairly good evidence, I think, that it might have been a factory retop. Also, on the heel itself, you can see this remnant of soundboard. There's a gap between it and the front face of the heel as well. So there we go. Who knows when it was done? I'm going to do a little finish work on the ES330 today, I think. This is part of the reason I should never put like a multi-part video series out there where it's labeled part 1, part 2, part 3, because expectation is that I do one thing and then move on to the next. But in reality, it's always multiple jobs going on at the same time. Just the way it works, folks. So this is like part 1.5. This plug is maybe 2 millimeters proud of the surface, so I have to cut it back down. Again, we're dealing with an arched top, so this is not flat. I have to plane this and get it close and then sort of finesse it into a shape that's sort of like the surroundings. Why don't I take off all the electronics? Well, I'm doing my best to not do that because that makes the job very, very expensive, and it might not be necessary. So I've got my trusty hand plane here, block plane, and it's not pretty, but the blade is sharp. And you see that I'm actually planing across the grain, which might be surprising to some people, but in a case like this where I'm eventually going to end up with a curve, if I go across, I don't really have to worry about the grain direction very much. What I'm shooting for is kind of a lump with the very edges or the perimeter flush with, in this case, the tape. That'll give me a little bit of room to sand and blend. And then I can work on the interior part and really kind of fair the curve. On to the cabinet scraper. This is a piece of steel which is kind of springy. The edge is square in cross-section, and it's been burnished into a little tiny hook, which acts like kind of a miniature plane blade, and it removes shavings of material, very controllable, and with this I can sort of model the surface and end up with the curve that I'm looking for. Delicate work. I'm going down to the level of the tape. Obviously that's on there to protect the finish. I'm continually checking with my fingers. It's easier to do it with touch than sight. And then eventually I'm playing through the tape and I can sort of get directly to the level of the lacquer around without digging into it, which is kind of nice. The cabinet scraper is flexible enough that I can bend it into a curve And that's how I achieve that without raking over the previously finished surface. Now on to some 220 grit sandpaper on a cork-backed block. Very small block. But this will sand the surface, and it's actually providing sort of a key for the sealer coat to latch onto. It's possible to sand things too smoothly if you're going to do a film finish. You don't really want to go higher than about 220 grit. No, I'm trying to show you the pigment stain on my finger. I'm not giving the guitar the finger. This is a very finely blended powdered pigment which is activated by lacquer or shellac or what have you. And it can be applied dry, usually with a fingertip, and blended into the surrounding color. To be honest, I wasn't happy with the way this turned out. It did not look good. It was blotchy, and I decided eventually to scrape this all clean and try a different approach. I got out my airbrush, and I'm using a lacquer which has been lightly tinted with a yellow tone, trying to get very close to the center of the sunburst in terms of density. Give myself a base upon which I can add the other colors in the sunburst. And this is, it's multiple coats. The airbrush is nice in that the lacquer dries very fast. And it's a very thin mix. It's about 50% lacquer, 50 thinner. So I'm going to build this up over time. Now I've added a drop of amber to the mix, which will create this sort of mid-tone. It's kind of a pumpkin-y sort of color. And I'll go back and give that several coats. And now finally the cherry red, in which I'll kind of mimic the burst. Some of this color will eventually be sanded off back to the clear lacquer below to kind of blend things even more. So I'm going a bit generous. I want to make sure that it goes right through the plug there. And that's where we're going to leave it this week. I'm going to shoot several more coats of clear lacquer on top of this, and we'll be ready to buff up and get this thing back in order. See you soon.